Royal Selection works with both European and North American private equity firms. We have a pretty unique perspective on what European private equity firms are missing out on that US private equity firms have executed well on. According to Statista, the number of European private equity firms is 3,146, with a current value of 118 billion of assets under management. The largest private equity firm in Europe is 10.3 billion assets under management. The largest private equity fund in Europe is $10.3 billion assets under management. According to Crunchbase, the number of private equity firms in the US is 4,401, with a total value of $3.5 trillion of assets under management, with the largest private equity firm in the US having raised $126.5 billion in the period of 2017 to 2022. So what are the common traits of US private equity firms that the European private equity firms could learn from? Number one is the operating partner model. It's become increasingly common for private equity firms in the US to appoint multiple operating partners. These operating partners are directly employed by the private equity firm themselves. In Europe, this is sometimes referred to as portfolio directors, and that's the most commonly job title used here. One of the things we've noticed is that it's much more common for US private equity firms to have operating partners within their firm in comparison with Europe. However, Europe has taken a slightly different approach to the US model. Europe typically appoints management consulting background experienced individuals and brings them in, as they refer to it, as portfolio directors into their firm. Whereas the US counterparts have taken predominantly a different stance of appointing previous C-suite executives, mostly with private equity-backed experience, and have completed exits within those private equity deals to then become operating partners, advisors, coaches, mentors to the existing portfolio companies. This obviously gives them a unique perspective because they're able to utilize their expertise and experience of actually growing a private equity-backed company to drive that business to obviously increased EBITDA numbers and therefore increased exit values. So Royal Selection would tell you, and I would tell you, that both of those models work well. But I suppose the question comes down to which one works the best. I think from our perspective and what we've seen, especially working heavily in the US, is that like non-executive directors are incredibly popular across all countries around the world, we see the operating partner model from a proven C-suite executive as a better way to be able to develop and drive success through the portfolio companies, as opposed to the management consulting route, which is predominantly adopted in Europe. This is predominantly down to the operating partners with C-suite experience and private equity-backed experience having the expertise and direct experience of running those businesses and driving them towards exits. Whereas, no disrespect to management consultants, but they tend to work on a project basis. They deep dive into a business, share feedback, not necessarily executing on the projects that they create and the ideas and synthesis that they will then put forward to the senior management team. With proven C-suite executives, a common comment of been there, done that, worn the t-shirts, you have those individuals who have that direct experience and exposure, and therefore we tend to build strong relationships with the C-suite executives in the portfolio companies as they have that experience that obviously all of the C-suite team within the portfolio is driving towards that exit. Of course, we do see challenges with some of that. If the operating partner that's been appointed is not quite ready to be hands-off yet and move into a more mentoring, coaching and developing type phase, then those individuals tend to get too hands-on and upset the C-suite executives. It's got to be like the perfect Ned type role, but on a full-time employed basis through the private equity firm, where they're supporting, driving, and using their experience, not hands-on in a business trying to take over. Position number 2 that we've seen commonly used in the US as opposed to in Europe is splitting the business development team and the actual deal team. So what I mean by business development is the deal origination side, and then having your, commonly referred to as, your execution team that then drive it. This is something we've seen in pockets in Europe, but I could probably only name a handful of private equity firms that have adopted this. And we're seeing it a lot more common currently in venture. But in the US, there's a number of firms that I know and could name 50 probably that have the business development approach and have whether it's an individual dedicated to BD/origination or an actual team dedicated to that process. I suppose the question always is, does it work? We're seeing this predominantly adopted in the US at the moment, which I'm going to guess if it didn't work, it would not be adopted. I know splitting down roles is not, for some investors or private equity investment professionals, isn't particularly attractive because they want the full gambit of it. But I'd probably say for most investors, the deal origination works probably one of the tougher end. And the common process is to leverage the connections and contacts, mostly of investment banks, whereas we're seeing a number of private equity firms now moving towards proprietary deal flow, which is obviously separating them significantly, which clearly drives significant numbers on their actual exit process. So I definitely see this as a definite win for a lot of PE firms to take this type of level of action to drive portfolio acquisition by an individual who's an absolute specialist, rather than trying to have a full deal team all doing minimal amounts of the role, and you've got somebody, at least one person, dedicated to that full process. And point number 3, we're seeing a significant increase in specialist firms. Like we see in venture capital now, more and more of the firms are becoming more and more niche in their particular specialisms of investment thesis of industries that they invest in. We're seeing this currently across Europe and North America. The majority of private equity firms are still generalist. They still invest in a multitude of different industries, and they specialize in either lower to middle market, small to mid cap, or large cap, etc. And that tends to be the differentiator. But something we are seeing in the US is an increasing number of firms that are going really specialist. Now, I'm not just talking about a private equity firm, for example, Archimed, specializing just in healthcare. I'm talking about private equity firms that specialize in just a linear specialist area within healthcare. For example, there's a private equity firm in the US that just specializes in supply chain companies. Now, we are starting to see more and more of these particular areas of private equity firms popping up that are usually the smaller ones in the initial phases that are really specializing and narrowing down on their niche. Now, what's interesting about this is we are starting to see this in both US and European private equity firms that are now starting to have specialists within the actual firm that not just specializing in healthcare, but specializing in a particular narrow niche within that. Not just specializing in manufacturing, specializing in a particular narrow niche within the manufacturing space. Still doing deals across manufacturing potentially, but have a particular investment thesis and driving that on a particular industry and really narrowing down. Now, we're not seeing this as a widespread at the moment, but we are seeing more of this in the US, and certainly we are seeing in Europe at the moment. One of the areas that's clearly more popular currently, albeit the public markets as of this video in end of 2022 has been obviously slaughtered, but the technology space and the disruption that that's creating within every industry, we're seeing more and more firms specialize just in specific areas of technology. For example, software. And we're even seeing firms going even narrow down and then narrow in a particular software industry rather than just being broad software in everything. Do we think that this will continue? I honestly think that it has to. There's so much capital available on the market. There are so many private equity firms for portfolio companies to choose from. It's making it increasingly difficult for portfolio companies to decide who is the person, who is the firm that they're going to sell to and do their exit to. There's so much competition, and it's not just coming down to who's got the most amount of dollar to throw at a business. It's coming down to where does the legacy drive, where does the future drive of that organization. Now, specialist firms have that differentiating factor that they can offer. Well, we know your industry better than anybody. And I don't know who said initially this quote, but the narrower your niche, the broader your appeal. So the focus that we're having as a firm at the moment for us at Raw Selection is mile deep and an inch wide with regards to our industry. Just specializing in private equity is not enough. We're going deep diving into the industries within the portfolio companies and going incredibly narrow on there so we can offer an even better outreach, we can offer an even tighter candidate pool and a more accurate private equity backed individual. And exactly the same on the private equity side with the investment and back office professional appointments. The narrower your niche, the broader your appeal. So I definitely see private equity moving this way, as we have seen with a lot of venture firms who've gone particularly specialist too. So that's everything from a European to US comparison process and what European private equity firms can learn from the United States. We typically see a lot of the trends happen in the US and then slowly move over into Europe, but that's not always the case. So thank you very much for listening and watching this today. Should you ever need portfolio executives for your private equity backed companies, or of course private equity professionals both on your deal side, maybe your BD origination side, and also your back office team, please do reach out to us at Raw Selection.